This is a response to a member of our Patreon community, Andreas Clark. Andreas poses the interesting question of how, in the kind of new economic system we talk about, one based, for example, on worker co-ops, on worker running their own enterprises, what we like to call worker self-directed enterprises, Andreas asks whether and how systems of checks and balances would work in a society like that, which wasn't capitalist anymore, which wasn't built around the struggle, the conflict, the shared disinterest in collective activity that so bedevils capitalist systems based on employers and employees. Well, my first response is to say that the system of checks and balances is one that I certainly like. I think it's one of the better parts of what was done in the American Revolution, setting that up and trying to hold on to it. But it would, of course, function differently in a different economic system from the way it functions here, if indeed functioning is what we want to say. Watching, for example, the Trump administration manipulate the courts from the Supreme Court on down, watching the struggle between the legislative and the executive branch about who has what authority over whom, shows and proves, and the Trump administration is not the only one that behaves this way, that it's a very iffy question how much real check and balance we have, how well it has worked, given how often it has failed. But put that aside, the idea is a good one. How might it work in a differently based economy? Well, here, one way to approach it is to look at some historical examples. Back in the early 1920s, in Germany, socialists took over the government there. It was a consequence of the collapse of Germany in the process of losing World War I. And in that process, the old regime collapsed. The Kaiser, that's the kind of government they had, abdicated. Socialists ended the war and basically took over. And here's an interesting thing they did that incorporated one idea of how checks and balances would work in a socialist arrangement. And of course, there are many kinds of socialist arrangement. But here's what the Germans did in the 1920s. They wrote a constitution that tried to establish some of this in the German city of Weimar, called the Weimar Republic or the Weimar Constitution. And here's how it worked. You had one legislature that people voted on based on where they lived. That's what we're familiar with in the West, in the United States. You vote based on your residence, and you elect people for a political government that governs you based on your residence. You have a mayor, you have a governor, you have senators and representatives all the way up to the president. The Germans did that kind of residence-based political representative government, but they instituted a very interesting check and balance on anything that government would do. And here's how they arranged it. A second house of their parliament was based also on voting, on representation, but not according to where you lived, but instead according to where you worked. That's right. In the store, in the factory, in the office, you and the other workers there would elect representatives to a parliamentary house, a Congress, a House of Representatives, if you like, based on your interests, your attitudes, your needs as a working person, which are different, the Germans thought, from your interests, activities, and concerns as a resident of a particular place. And now you get the interesting idea, these two houses can operate a system of checks and balances on one another. In other words, for a piece of legislation to become law, you might insist that both houses, the house based on your residence and the house based on your job, both have to agree. That would be a little bit like making the Senate and the House agree, but of course both of them depend only on where you reside in terms of where your votes are, not where you work. And it might be important to give workers, one person, one vote on the job, a kind of democratic voice through their workplace that could operate as a check on the democratic, more or less, voice in the neighborhood where they reside. Beyond that, you could, of course, have a judiciary. You could give it a considerable amount of independence so that disputes between people and enterprises, between enterprise and so on, could be adjudicated, could be worked out in a separate branch of government that was judicial, that was also democratically rooted, more so, for example, than the one here in the United States, where a great deal of the judiciary is nominated by a politician, not elected by people, etc. So you could replicate, you could develop a system of checks and balances in a socialist system, in a system whose economy was based on worker co-ops. I think you could do it in a more democratic way, but in any case, it is a good idea, and it is one that we learn from, just as we learn from other things in history. As you move forward, as we do better than capitalism, it doesn't mean we reject everything about capitalism. We look for what's worth preserving and then adjust it to the new circumstances. Just like in capitalism, they took things from the past, like the Magna Carta or all kinds of declarations of human rights, and then tried to adjust them more or less to the new capitalist reality. We would do the same with the next phase of human history in terms of economic systems. Thank you, Andreas Clark, and again, thank you to the entire Patreon community. I hope you found this response interesting.